like I was saying, the hill climb discipline, especially in the UK, is quite weird and quite eccentric. You know, the bikes are kind of weird. It's sort of people think like, why would you, as you said at the start, why would you drive hours for a race that lasts for 2 minutes long?
Hello and welcome to the podcast, GoOff. Today we go into the UK and we have a guest coming on there. So welcome, Tom.
Hi Simon, thanks for having me on.
So brief introduction. Let us know a little bit who you are. From my perspective, you are one of the coaches that I was looking into when I first started climbing, with the material you produced online and your results. And this was very motivating for me, but the word to you.
Oh, thank you. Firstly, that's really nice to hear. So I'm Tom. I suppose am a coach and an athlete. In the past, I've raced on the mountain bike primarily. I raced at kind of like a World Cup sort of international level. Was never challenging for a World Cup win or anything like that, but still had some really good experiences. Racing some of the European World Cups, and I went to a World Championships in the mountain bike marathon discipline. In terms of my results, I suppose notable ones were winning the mountain bike marathon national title in, I think, 2017. Narrowly missed out on the title of the cross country Olympic discipline in 2018. And then kind of coming up to the pandemic, obviously things got international travel got very difficult for those that weren't sort of salaried or supported by this sort of international cycling federation. So I didn't do as much mountain bike racing from about 2019, 2020 onwards. And that's when I moved into more of like a UK centric discipline, which is hill climb time trials, where you're essentially, it's who can ride from the bottom of the climb to the top the fastest. And in the UK, most of the climbs are pretty short. I would say the average length for a UK hill climb is probably 4 or 5 minutes. Sometimes they're 1 minute to 90 seconds, and probably the longest one is maybe 20 to 30 minutes. So they're nothing like kind of alpine climbs. So I, as an athlete, have sort of a naturally high VO2 max. So it was always quite good on sort of short, sharp hill climb efforts. So I started racing hill climbs quite a bit from about 2020, started focusing on that as kind of, I guess, my primary discipline, and then managed to win the national title in 2021 after having come fairly close with a silver medal in 2020. And then I got a silver medal again in 2022. I've sort of been on the mountain bike and the hill climb side, and then on the coaching side, I run a small company with my wife, and we produce information resources, whether that's sort of free articles or some of the paid resources like online PDFs and different guides. And then we also
critical power calculator that is online and it's useful.
Exactly,
calculations.
Little tools like that. And then we also provide kind of coaching and performance consulting services to athletes as well. So I work directly with some athletes, and then more on a sort of one-off basis, just to give people advice and guidance. So that they're kind of the services we do. We used to do testing, in-person kind of physiological testing, but we don't do that as much anymore.
I'll stop you instead on one thing. You said hill climbing races that can last a minute and a half or 2 minutes upwards. I mean, do people really do that? I mean, they move to a place to make a race of 2-3 minutes. Because for Italian standards, this is, so yeah, I have to take the car to make a 2 minutes of a race. I'll not even consider it.
Yeah, it's really strange. I think it's one of the sort of odd sort of eccentric things about hill climbing is that there are some UK people who will travel 3-4 hours in a car to race for 90 seconds on a particular climb. And it's
it's not like 5 repeats on the climb. It's one shot. The time you get, that's it.
It's one climb. Yeah, it's one effort, and it can be over, as I say, in 90 seconds sometimes. And there are particular people in the UK hill climb scene who are very explosive, very, very powerful riders that wouldn't do as well on a climb that was sort of any longer than maybe 3 minutes, and they specifically target these very, very short, very, very punchy hill climbs. There's one in particular that's called Monsal, and it has sort of spectators. The photos are really cool and the atmosphere is really cool on the day, because it's a very, very short road that gets closed, and there's barriers and spectators lining the course sort of every year. So it's almost like the finish of like a grand tour or some kind of really big cycling race. And yeah, it's I think, I can't remember exactly what the record is, but it's under 2 minutes, so it's really, really short.
No, that's nice. I think it's a big cultural differences. For example, in Italy, people don't go to some races because they are under 2-3 hours, and on road bikes. Instead, moving there to make this kind of effort and follow this kind of competition, I really like it, because it means, commitment for a certain type of events and effort. And well, yeah, I'm happy that these things are happening around, and I would love to have this kind of stuff also in Italy. But is it organized like a series, or is there single events that are independent one from each other, and there is no common calendar?
Yeah, the season sort of unofficially runs from sort of the start of September to the end of October, so it's only really a 2-month period that the races are kind of collected around, and it isn't really a series. They're all just independent events that are run by typically a local cycling club. But the kind of governing body, so there's the international governing body, which is British Cycling, and then there's another body called Cycling Time Trials, who run all the time trials and hill climbs being included in that. And they are non-UCI affiliated, so they're not an international body. So they have like I guess they have like a hill climb rankings. So depending on which events you do and who else enters those events, there's kind of an algorithm that puts you in like a leaderboard that you can obviously sort of look at the end of the year. But I don't think there's any sort of prize for winning that leaderboard, and they're really just independent events, and you can just look through a calendar, and typically between September and October there are numerous events going on around the country that you can just choose to enter and go along to. And as you say, it's a really sort of accessible way of racing, because it doesn't take too long. If you find a local one, you could drive there in 20-30 minutes and race, just for a very short period of time and be done in the morning. And yeah, it's and people really get into it. It's got a real kind of, it's not a big discipline. I don't think too many people do it or know about it, but those that do and those that are interested in it, it's got a real sort of cult following of sort of diehard people.
So we could say it's a little bit maybe similar to cyclocross in Belgium. It's something that people really look forward to in a specific period of the year. But do people take this as their main priority, or let's say they do mountain bike and road, and then they insert this because they like it and add it? I mean, there are special specialists that go for this only, or is it more broad? And I mean, some of the guys or most of the guys that do, for example, Grand Fondos or some kind of events, then go also to hill climbing.
Yeah, I think typically it's been kind of like an end of season blowout, or a way to kind of use remnants of the form that you still have from like a road or a mountain bike season, and just do some kind of more fun and shorter events. But now I think since the sort of hill climb scene's been picked up by a few sort of media sources and it's got written about, I think people, there are a handful of athletes, and I think I'd include myself in this sort of previously, and there are a couple of others that really do see the hill climb season as their main target for the year. So they may well race on the road, traditional road races, or as you say, sportives and Grand Fondos, or be on the mountain bike. But that's almost secondary to what they're going to be doing from September to October. There are, I think, increasingly more and more cyclists who are actually seeing the hill climb season as their a priority sort of focus for the year. So, but there are still plenty of people who will primarily just have their main goals be be road or mountain bike, and then
Yeah,
just
yeah.
do the hill climb season for a bit of extra fun.
Yeah, close the season. I mean, it's it's a similar to a ramp test. You suffer a lot, but it's also quite short.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so you go for it. But okay, yeah, and I've been a little bit around UK and I've seen on Strava, the hill climb stuff, this and there. I was going up on 5 watts per kilogram and I saw it was like 50, 100 people in front of me. I was like, yeah, that's unusual. Or
Yeah.
and then I understood a little bit where it comes from because they are making the races there, stuff and stuff, again and again. Uh, what I've also seen, maybe from some videos or some articles, is the weight weenies that go into this. No, because I mean hill climb, watts per kilo, more or less. That is the idea. No, so is it people have special bikes for that? No, or they try to adapt for the race?
Yeah, as I alluded to before, it's governed by a body that isn't UCI affiliated, so there's no UCI weight limit imposed on the bike. So that basically means that everyone kind of, or a lot of people kind of go crazy with making their bikes as light as possible. Because as you say, unless it's a very sort of shallow climb, watts per kilo. I mean, even on any climb, I think watts per kilogram is really the key sort of factor. But especially on the very sort of shorter, steeper ones, that obviously is something to really sort of really try to optimize. So yeah, people remove anything extraneous from the bike. There are rules that you have to have like a saddle and you have to have a front and a rear brake, so you can't
Okay,
sort of take
okay,
everything
nice.
off. So it remains relatively safe. And until recently, actually, I think until after 2020, until 2021, there was no mandatory. It wasn't mandatory to wear a helmet, so
Ah,
everyone
okay,
just would ride up
yeah,
in kind of a cap like you've got on, Simon,
yeah,
or
yeah,
like
yeah.
or nothing. So
To
so
cover
yeah,
ground,
yeah, it's
whatever it
exactly.
is. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's an easy weight saving, but yeah, people will run like a one by setup that's more you've been more familiar with on like a gravel or a mountain bike. The wheels are often very very light. They usually clinchers, and they still use rim brakes because they're the lightest. And some people will go as far as drilling holes in their chain rings and rear derailleurs and this kind of thing, just to make the bike as light as possible.
Do people also, let's say, leave only 2 or 3 specific gears for a race, or usually they have the cassette and that's it? Because
Yeah, there have been certain courses and certain riders who have used single speed
Mhm.
bikes for particular courses where there isn't a great change in the gradient. So the speeds, the difference between the sort of highest speed and the lowest speed you'd achieve on the climb aren't particularly. There's not a great deal of difference, so you can get away with like a single chainring. Most of the people that have been at the sort of top end of the results in the past few years, from what I can see, have used fairly traditional gears. So whether that's like a
Mhm.
1128 or something like that on the back, and then usually the chainring on the front chain is the thing that changes the most. So if
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
really really steep climb, it might be a
Mhm.
36 or a 38 tooth, and something shallower might even go to like a 44, something a little bit bigger.
Yeah. You won a title and made some podiums. Did you alter your bike for the race, or what was your setup and the weight of the bike for the race?
So I never really went too far
Okay.
with making it really really light. So it's the bike was still probably 5.4 kilograms. So it's quite a bit below.
Okay.
It's a
Okay.
lightweight bike.
It's
Where
a light
anyone
bike.
that yeah, anyone that picks it up, is quite surprised with how light it is. But you do see people that go to almost sort of 4.8 kilograms, and that usually involves spending a lot of money on very kind of exotic parts, and also risking some sort of structural integrity with the bike as well. So I think I found like a nice sort of middle ground with it being about 5.4, 5.5. Usually I would keep the setup very, very similar. It's just a basic kind of rim brake carbon road bike with carbon clincher wheels and sort of Shimano Dura-Race Ultegra kind of components. So nothing really really exotic. And yeah, as I say, the chain ring on the front would usually change if it was particularly steep or the speeds were a bit higher because it was a shallower climb. And then specifically for the 2021 hill climb, where I managed to win, I actually put a like a winter, like a grippier, wet weather specific tire on because it was a very wet day. And lots of people were having traction issues with the rear wheel just slipping. So I was quite mindful of that and did a bit of testing on a few different tires, and eventually settled on like a Pirelli winter tire. And I used that in the race and didn't have any kind of issues with slipping that I think did cause some of the other riders, to have slightly slower times or to get into difficulty. So that was kind of a big change that I used in that particular race.
Instead, from the coaching perspective, how do you train for a race like this, or also in general? Because having raced a little bit around Europe, I've seen quite a lot of British people in mountain races. And as you told me, the main climbs in the UK are pretty short. So how do people train for the hill climb thing, and how do people train usually for longer climbs in the UK? What is the approach here?
Yeah, well, as I said, the sort of longest climbs you can really find in the UK is maybe sort of 30 minutes long for sort of
you really have to find it.
Yeah, you do. They're not everywhere, and usually that would have sort of shallower sections in it as well, because if it was just really steep, you just run out of elevation quite quickly. And as we talked about before, there are some hill climb events that maybe only last 90 seconds, 2 minutes. So there is a very different kind of training approach for a 2-minute climb versus something that's more 15 to 20 minutes, and it will suit a different type of rider. So the guys and women who do very well in very, very short climbs look very different and train very differently to those that succeed more on the longer climbs. I would say in any case, having a strong aerobic foundation or a big base of fitness is always important, because even on the very short climbs, there's still a lot of energy being contributed aerobically. So have the bigger the base is, I think we kind of all know this by now, but the bigger that aerobic base is, the better. But then I think how you actually approach the sort of higher intensity training is quite different. So the guys the people that do well in the very, very short disciplines spend quite a lot of time in the gym, actually working on sort of neuromuscular power and just sort of raw strength. And I think, as I was saying a bit about myself, I think a high VO2 max kind of is probably one of the key performance predictors for the shorter climbs, maybe up to sort of 5 or 6 minutes. And then as you get to the longer climbs, I think power at your sort of second threshold, so whether that's a second lactate threshold or FTP or critical power, is probably the highest performance predictor there. So I think everyone still needs to kind of do that base training. If you're targeting the hill climb season, I think spending most of the year doing longer work and being very patient with building a strong aerobic base is important. But then at a certain point coming into the season, you need to then add the high intensity abilities on top of that, and that is probably where the key differences are between someone that's aiming for a longer climb or a shorter climb, or someone who is naturally kind of gifted for one of those.
Yeah. So reading into this, you are also saying that to train for longer climbs, you don't necessarily need longer climbs around your area. So this obviously could help, but the main goal being building a big aerobic engine. This can be achieved also on the flat, or maybe indoor, or maybe on the down terrain somehow, if you manage to do it correctly.
Yeah, I think that's correct. As you say, I think in an ideal situation, you have the long climbs to actually be able to train on, and that makes your training as sort of at a certain point as specific as it can be. But with the advent of kind of indoor training and so the ability to kind of virtually have climbs and roads that are uninterrupted, and with tools like erg mode where you can dial into, have yourself locked into a certain intensity, those kind of things can augment some of these some of the sort of experiences you would have in a longer climb without actually having the climbs there in the real world, sort of on your doorstep.
Yeah, I think indoor cycling changed a lot in the last 5 years, maybe after or with the COVID, probably forever changed how cycling is perceived by amateurs, because it was such a big impact. And I can imagine in the UK that I've been a couple of times in the UK because my brother lives in London, and the weather it's let's say different from what we are used in Southern Europe or something. And do you see that this help like the age groupers train differently, more consistently, or do you think in the British culture there was already this mentality that, oh man, if it rains you still go out and doesn't change much? Because in Italy, if it rains, I don't go out. If it's below 7 degrees, I don't go out. I go on Watopia.
I think there used to be more of a culture of, you just go out in the wet weather. You layer up, you put the right kind of waterproof gear on, and you just kind of go out, and it's not very nice. I mean, I think the sort of conditions where you get the coldest are often much like what you get in the UK, where it's just above freezing. So it's not kind of snowing. It's still raining. There's still a lot of water coming down. But then you have this combination of cold weather, the winds, it can be pretty windy in the UK as well. The wind chill takes it almost to a sort of feels like temperature below 0 degrees. And it's really, really hard, especially with your extremities, like your hands and feet, to stay warm. And it's tough. And I think indoor training is making UK riders softer in that approach. There definitely isn't. There's definitely more, I think, of a feeling now that if it's bad weather outside, then it's way better to go on the indoor trainer. I think that's probably true. But I think the culture before was probably just everyone rides in bad weather. People still ride in bad weather. Whereas I think nowadays indoor training has just improved so much from when I think back to when I was at university on like a magnetic trainer in my sort of university dorm room, with no
watching an empty screen or a movie
exactly.
or something.
And just the wheels slipping and everything. It's so much better nowadays to train indoors. So it's understandable why people don't ride as much in the rain in the UK, I don't think.
Yeah, my idea there is that the direct drive indoor trainers made a big difference because they're more consistent, they measure the power fairly accurately, and also having the possibility to use the erg mode or to have adaptations based on the route that you do. I mean, makes it easier, makes it fun, makes it different. But do you think there are problems connected to that? I mean, you said there are advantages. What are the main disadvantages that are brought by indoor training? What happens to the people that, let's say, spend the majority of the time indoor instead of outdoors?
Yeah, I think if you're training for something outdoors, your events are like outdoors, which most events are. I think if you rely too much on indoor training, I think you can sort of see all the advantages it brings, and just think that it's almost superior to riding outside. But it is a very different thing. And I kind of mentioned specificity before with the sort of long climbs. I think you have to make training specific to the demands of what you're training for to really get the most out of it. So riding outside, I think if you're training for something that is outside, is a necessity. And I think, especially on like a direct drive trainer, one that's just very fixed. I know that there are some with kind of sway features now and that move a little bit and steering, but it doesn't ever really recreate sort of what is happening outside. The bike doesn't move around underneath you quite the same. I don't think your muscle fiber recruitment patterns are the same. So there is sort of missing parts that leave some gaps between what you sort of need to train for outside.
I see this coming also from your background, because you say you are from the mountain biking perspective, also the mountain biking world. And I mean, this makes sense for me. In mountain bike, you have to understand how to ride your bike, how to recover when you do a downhill, stay stiff, how to change quickly, your pace, your rhythm. That is probably not something that you can achieve indoors, no? So you see big differences in road and mountain bike, and more or less between the people that you train, you coach. How many people do one thing, and how many do the other thing, and how many do they do both? To have a broad idea.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think primarily most of them are on the road, and there are some that do a little bit of both. But I think thinking to sort of who I work with, most of them are more sort of focused on the road. And if they do mountain bike, it's more of like just an extra sort of challenge or something they enjoy doing a little bit.
But do you think that having them also do mountain bike helps them on the road, or on the contrary, does it limit them a little bit on the road?
I think it does help because there are a lot of similarities between someone that's good on the road and good on the mountain bike. I mean, it's easy to point to examples like Tom Pidcock and Mathieu van der Poel, but I think they're just the best sort of cyclists in the world, period. So they're just, they can do anything essentially. But there are other cyclists as well who do both mountain bike and road. So Victor Koretsky, for one, who is sort of a Bora Hansgrohe athlete on the road, but races a lot of mountain bike as well. Again, I think both disciplines, you need a good base of aerobic fitness that kind of underpins everything, and then there are subtle differences in, I think, the efforts that you need to do and the sort of physiological abilities that you have. So I think, broadly speaking, on the mountain bike you probably need a bit of a higher anaerobic capacity and VO2 max, just because it's such a stochastic event where there's big spikes in power that demand, because of the terrain, demand a high kind of torque on the pedals. So like a greater sort of muscular demand, whereas on the road it's a little bit smoother, but you kind of have to lock into like a longer effort and be able to sustain a very high power output for a long period of time. But I think if you're good at one thing, if you're really good on the mountain bike, I think that can fill in for gaps that you might have on the road bike and vice versa. So I think probably if you were really trying to dial yourself in to be a road rider, I think there's an opportunity cost to spending more time on the mountain bike rather than doing your specific discipline. But I think for most people who haven't got every single thing optimized, I think doing a bit of both can really help. And as you mentioned before, like in a technical skills sense as well, I think you gain a lot of things from the mountain bike, and how, where the surface is potentially not as grippy, or you need to just really kind of dial in your handling skills. I think that can obviously translate over to the road, and there's plenty of free speed to be had on descents and cornering and this kind of thing if you know what you're doing.
Also, staying in groups maybe can be handled with different security. If you're used to the mountain bike, you probably have a control of the bike that is very, very high, also the balance and something. So when you start going into the groups, at first you're more in a comfort zone. Then still, also being in a group, you have to push a little bit with the shoulders left and right, and don't be scared of that, which probably mountain bike, I don't know how much is that common, because you're not so close one to each other usually, no? But
after during the start, because the mountain bike events are mass start events, there's quite a lot of that. There's quite a lot of jostling for position. You do have to be, kind of sharp elbows and be a little bit aggressive. So that, but you're right. It then sort of spreads out to be more like a sort of effort, a maximal effort that everyone kind of does at the same time. But there's certainly at the start of races and in mountain bike marathon races where it tends to stay in groups for longer. It's more like a road racing dynamic, and then I suppose gravel is sort of halfway between the two, where it has
that was the intent of gravel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'll make you a different question. So let's say I'm an amateur at 3.5, 4 watts per kilo, whatever. And I really like both mountain bike and road racing. and I have to plan my season. Would you, as a coach, rather have me do the first 4 months only mountain bike and then 4 months of road, I mean racing? Or would you rather have me make, let's say I race every 2 weeks, once I do mountain bike, then in 2 weeks I do road, then I go back to mountain bike, so I can, let's say, alter and continuously change the disciplines. What would be your preferred choice?
That's a good question. I think it would primarily come down to the goals of that athlete. So if they were looking for sort of pure enjoyment and they really liked varying things up, then I think that kind of alternating approach would be a good thing. So that you don't just kind of get burnt out with just doing one discipline for a while and then moving on to something else. I think for sort of a pure performance and again like a specificity kind of idea, probably having key competition periods throughout the year that you sort of train up towards and then rest afterwards and then train up to the next one, clustering those probably into more sort of uh, homogenous discipline situations would be probably a good way to go, just because you could then specifically train more and more on the mountain bike if you've then got a 2 or 3 week period of mountain bike races.
Yeah.
Have a bit of a break after that key competition period, and then switch your focus to then building up more for, say, the road bike and honing in the specific abilities that'll help you more in those events. But I mean, that's very sort of generalized. I think that there are probably some athletes that might benefit from having it be a bit more mixed, because I think variety has its benefits as well. So I think in that situation, I would be sort of speaking to the athlete and seeing what what they wanted to prioritize, in the sense of maybe, as I say, having a bit more fun and variety, or really kind of performing well in a couple of key events.
So it depends a little bit on the goal. So probably if you race to win or you race to make a podium or the best possible results, probably choosing blocks of compatible races or similar races makes sense. If your main goal instead is to reach, let's say, decent levels, but your effort into cycling from 1 to 10 is 7, 8, 6, then mixing can make you happier at the end of the story, no? So
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. That's interesting. Because some people think, and I know that, but I've only raced mountain bikes in the past 2 months. Now I need 2 months or 3 to adapt to the road and go to main. I will not make the first race on road unless I have 2 or 3 months specifically on the road, and then I'll just go into that. And I don't really think it's too necessary, especially if the people are coming from marathon mountain bike and go to Grand Fondos, or if they go from criteriums to cross country. Those things are, for some characteristics, pretty similar, no? So, and you can probably also have some benefits varying the disciplines to change a little bit how you feel, the people you see around, some motivation. Maybe sometimes you go better on the road, sometimes on the mountain bike, and this can drive you through the season. No? So you have an excuse. You have an excuse. I didn't do so good because last week I was on the road. Now I go to mountain bike, and it's easy to tell your friends.
It gives you exactly. It gives you a bit of an excuse. But that's a really good point. Actually, is there are off-road and on-road disciplines that do share a lot of the same similarities. So if that was the way you could organize a season as well, I think that would bridge that gap a little bit. So as with your example, the mountain bike marathon discipline would have durations that are quite similar to a road ride, and the group dynamics would be very similar. And as I said before, I think for mountain bike and for more road disciplines, your sort of foundational training early on in the training process is very similar anyway. So you probably quite a lot of your training would probably be very similar, whether you were a road rider or a mountain bike rider. It would then be more in the sort of weeks leading up to some events that you do. Your training would probably become more specific. So I think both scenarios could work well. It would just depend on the athlete and what they were training for.
And when evaluating instead the athlete, what is your typical approach to, let's say, you start training with a new person, comes to you for the first time, and say, yeah, I want to start training. I've been riding my bike since 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever. I've never had a coach before, and I usually do 10, 12 races a year. What kind of tests do you like from them? Is there something standard, or do you try to vary the tests that you do based on the people that you have in front?
Yeah, it's more the kind of latter situation, and it usually comes down to what testing they might have done in the past, what sort of tools they have, and what sort of opportunities they have to test. So some of them may be able to go into a lab and just you get a look a little bit under the hood at their sort of physiology, and sometimes you're just limited to field-based testing, which is fine as well. And then some athletes don't want to do lots of testing; some want to do lots of it. It is very different person to
Someone
person.
wants to do a lot of it. Really?
There are people out there.
I think UK is really an incredible country. I've never.
Not even.
I've
I mean,
never
not
had
even in
one
the
person.
UK. Sometimes not even in the UK. I mean, there's plenty of US athletes that are very, come from a data background. So maybe their day job is in sort of something data related. So they're very interested in applying those kind of that kind of insight to themselves. But yeah, I think the goal really initially, I think, is to figure out sort of what that athlete's strengths and limiters profile looks like. So for instance, with field-based testing, you could use like a critical power method where you would test sort of maximal efforts over some shorter and some longer durations, and feeding that into the model that will give you an estimation of that critical power, so that maximal point of sort of metabolic stability, or that crossover point between the sort of heavy and severe intensity domain. And it will also give you something like the W prime, or what is sort of similar to like an anaerobic capacity. So you can sort of compare the two and see in a very sort of general sense whether they're sort of more gifted on the sort of anaerobic glycolytic side of things, or more on the sort of aerobic side. Talking very, very generally, these terms aren't totally accurate, but essentially you're looking to try and figure out what that athlete's kind of strengths and limiters profile is, and then you can look at the ideal strengths and limiters profile for an athlete training to succeed or training to do well in the events that they're training for, and almost sort of superimpose one over the top to see where gaps exist, or how those two align or don't align, so that you can then sort of either in some cases advise and say maybe this isn't the right kind of discipline for someone of your particular physiological makeup, or more likely is that, okay, this sort of aspect of your fitness is fairly strong already. Here and here are where there's the biggest areas of opportunity, the sort of lowest hanging fruit. That's the kind of, as much as we're going to do some sort of generalized foundational training anyway, there's a few areas here where you've got a bit of a weakness that does relate to what you're training for. So that's where the probably the best areas to focus are.
Yeah, that's interesting. Also, how you explain it, because more or less, from what I understood, you're also trying to compare a power curve of the person with a power curve of a person that is successful in what these people want to do. And so you make the evidence in front of them somehow, and you see, here are the main problems. We have to work on this, and here is a good part. And also comparing this to another discipline, you say, if you would raise criteriums instead of ground founders, you're very strong in this part. Did you ever think about this or something? But usually, do you try to move people into a discipline that, let's say, makes their best part come out, or do you say rather, your weak points in these disciplines are this and this, we'll try to work on this first? So you prefer to direct the athlete towards something that you can see that he could have a lot of success, or do you more tend to accommodate the person towards what he wants?
Yeah, I think it's fairly rare for me to probably recommend that they go to a different discipline. So there are some athletes that maybe do a mixture of a mixture of a few different things, and you might say, based on your what we can see about your sort of physiological strengths and limiters, this particular one might be the best for you. You can probably expect better results in this rather than in A rather than B. But yeah, usually the athlete comes and they know what they like and they want to just do the best that they can in this particular discipline because they enjoy it. And it's not really about, they're not trying to make a professional career out of it. So usually it's just about training them in a way to optimize for the discipline that they enjoy more so than finding another one. But sometimes people ask, they might be more open to trying different things, and what based on what you can see sort of from their strengths and limiters, what would be the best one to do, and that information can feed into advising on that sort of thing.
So far we talked about RPE, which is, let's say, subjective, and we talked about critical power, which is power data. We didn't mention so far some other metrics that are pretty common. So heart rate first. Is it something that you consider secondary, or in my case, I consider it a way to confront the watts. So I always look at the heart rate only, not always only, I will not be so drastic, but usually I compare the evolution of the heart rate to the watts and don't look into it on its own. What do you think about heart rate like nowadays? How do you look at it?
Yeah, I think I always sort of think that heart rate data improves power data and power data improves heart rate data. So it's like they qualify each other, and it gives you more of an insight into what's going on. Heart rate's a very good measure of input, so actually how hard you were working. Obviously, it's important to see it's usually important to see what the output of that is, because that really, races aren't won on the basis of who tried the hardest. It was, what resulted in the greatest output. Typically, obviously, other things, tactics, skills, etc. But I think RPE, as sort of rudimentary as it is, I think RPE is just as important as heart rate, if not more important. I think because heart rate does fluctuate a lot with various different factors, and especially in a race, in a very sort of adrenaline fueled, high octane situation, your heart rate values that you typically might follow or see in training kind of go out the window, and you really are left with RPE and your sort of sense of your pacing skills and your sense of how hard things are in any particular moment. So I think actually having RPE, heart rate and power all together is the ideal situation. Really trying to pay attention to how they all relate to each other and interact, and how and actually thinking about RPE quite a lot, because it's something that you can use to great effect if you're really tuned into it for pacing in training and racing.
And let's say if you have two sensors, so RPE, you have it always because you can understand how you feel. You have two sensors, one of the two dies. Which one would you rather that you miss data? You would rather keep on having heart rate, or you would rather keep on having the power for the rest of the ride as a coach to understand the data?
That's a good question. I think I would still prefer to have the heart rate die, because I think RPE can fill in for heart rate in some kind of way. It would be a loss to not have the heart rate data, because you can look at all kinds of things with heart rate. This sort of session compared to a similar session previously, how sort of your internal feelings were affected by temperature or by the duration of a ride, and you can look at how the heart rate changes relative to power over the course of a ride. You can be used as a bit of an efficiency measure compared to heart rate. So like with Training Peaks as efficiency factor metric, for example. But I think RPE is still covering that kind of input side of things. So you would still have an input and an output. If the heart rate died, you would have power and RPE. So that's what I would probably say. But I think depending on the training session and the goals of that, sometimes heart rate is more important than the power output, I think.
Yeah, nice. I agree with this. So, but also going into more advanced metrics. So in the past year, probably coming from triathlon, there was a lot of development on the lactate measurement. This is something that also on the amateur side became more and more popular, to the point that people started taking it into consideration. Before, from my experience, it was a metric that was done once per year. When you go to the test, to the lab, you make the test, you have your values at 2 millimoles, 4 millimoles, or whatever, and more or less that's it, and see you next year. What do you think about lactate? And if you want to introduce how you see lactate, so why is it relevant and what it is, in the coaching perspective, why is it useful?
Yeah, well, I think it's been used for ages, but I think it's come to prominence more through sort of media and things like that in the last few years, as you say, with maybe Norwegian Triathlon and Inigo San Milan talking about it with his sort of coaching of Pogacar and the UAE team. Yeah, so lactate is essentially, it's a metabolic byproduct of glycolysis. So it's we measure its accumulation in the blood, and that gives kind of an indirect indication, I suppose, of like muscular activity and fuel utilization and energy system usage. And I think it's another data point that you can use, and especially if you're a professional athlete and you have a team, but you have the resources to be able to test regularly, and you have a coach or a set of coaches that can make sense of the data. I think it's a useful tool to add. I mean, if you could, why wouldn't you if you're a professional? But in terms of like its value to the amateur cyclist, I think, as you alluded to there, the typical way it works is someone goes into a lab for a lactate test, say once or twice a year, and gets some values that then they hopefully can translate into day-to-day training. So you'd relate like a lactate curve to heart rate or power. In our experience, it's not as simple. It'd be really nice if you could go into a lab, run through a very standardized test protocol and get a really, really clear set of data that gives you all the information you need. And in our experience, that's not really the case. I think you need multiple tests over a sort of short period of time to get to sort of account for anomalies and just account for day-to-day variation in how you feel. Depending on the equipment that's used in a lab, it might not be the same as what you use out on the road or out on the trail. So there's a sort of transferability question there. As I said, it is still an indirect measure. You're looking at accumulation of something in the blood, which is the net result of production and sort of clearance or elimination, and you don't really know what the production rate is or the clearance rate is. You're just seeing the end result of it, and you can sort of test one day to the next, a bit like how heart rate varies day to day and has influence in factors. Lactate's the same, so it can be quite difficult. I think if you're willing to, as an amateur, do a couple of tests, and then maybe once you've estimated like a second threshold, sort of honing in on that and using a different protocol that uses sort of longer steps clustered around that figure, you can then hone in and figure out a bit more for yourself where those values are. I think there's a lot of value in figuring out a general range of the first threshold as well, and using that in training and seeing really whether the testing tells you that your first or second threshold is sort of much higher than we would expect. In which case, that's a good sign. Or in most cases, a lot lower. Especially with that first threshold, there are a lot of amateurs out there that just train too hard, and they could really a lactate test can really show them that this, there's a ceiling here that's much easier than what you think you should be doing, and there'd be a lot of value to actually starting from a very sort of patient approach at a lower level and building things up from the bottom. So I think there are always things you could get from lactate testing, but it's a question of resources, and you do have to kind of work to understand the data, I think, because it's not as clear cut as it might seem.
Yeah. So yeah, in my opinion, also I come from the same perspective as you do. So it makes sense if you use it a lot. So do it once occasionally, doesn't change anything, doesn't give a benefit. As I see it, if people want to go in this way, it can be useful, can be very useful to confirm also some other data that come from power meter measurements or heart rate measurements and everything. But it has to be a lot of testing done this way. For example, I would like to have at least once at the end of every mesocycle, so every 3-4 weeks, to see how the block of training that you did moved eventually the first or the second threshold. Because with lactate, more or less, those are the two main things that you look into. Probably then how do you recover the lactate? How do you say it? Sorry, how do you dissipate it, or how does it go down? But that is already, let's say, a little bit more advanced training that even pro teams don't test on the day-to-day basis their athletes during the season. They might do that in the off season when they have people available in training camps or so. But from what I understood, pro athletes don't monitor this constantly because it's difficult to do at the end of the story. It would be easy, and it might get easier in the next years. Then we might see something different. But as it is now, it's kind of complicated. But from the amateur side, instead, I really think that the definition of the first threshold, and you already mentioned this, is something that might surprise a lot of people. Because let's say we go for an easy ride. Yeah, easy ride. You check a little bit the zones, and you say that this was not so easy. And if you have a confirmation from, let's say, a lactate measurement that after 2 hours of your easy ride, you have a lactate of 2.8, that, yeah, easy, but that's not so easy, man. And people probably with some data like that would understand that there is a lot of potential, a lot of training that can be done at a pace that they think is not producing anything. And to have a tool that tells you this is something that can support the way you teach some people. And this is probably the main thing that I like from the lactate measurements. So having a confirmation that there can be metrics that can be vastly improved with, let's say, light work as it is perceived by the athlete. And of course, it has to be well addressed, and it's not only the light work that will bring benefits to the first threshold, for example, but still is something that you see moving after a certain type of work that is not necessarily killing you, or you see that also only training in between the first and the second threshold, as you sometimes do inadvertently because you like to do the ride with your friends, doesn't bring this much benefit, rather than training lower and higher, so even make more specific approach.
Yeah, I think the culture now is quite geared towards, there's a lot of material out there for sort of time crunch cyclists, and the sort of usual way around the sort of time limited problem is intensity and intensifying training. And I think there are a lot of amateurs out there that would really benefit from just being very patient, starting from scratch, and use, as you said, using that first threshold as a bit of like a recalibration for what an easy RPE or an easy effort actually is, and having that as a bit of a ceiling to keep them from like a natural tendency to go harder and harder. Because as you said, there's this disconnect between feeling like, yeah, I want to be faster in these races, but I'm going, why should I be riding around like painfully slowly? And for some people, it might even mean avoiding any sort of, particularly steep climbs, because depending on their gearing and everything, they just cannot stay easy enough. They just can't keep it easy enough. So, and it might take months and months of that kind of painfully slow training to actually get it to move that first threshold to a point that's reasonable. But the sort of gains that you can get from doing that are enormous. If you can sort of add 50, 100 watts to the power output that you're producing before you start significantly burning carbohydrates or using other less efficient muscle fibers, that makes an enormous difference. It's a different game. You're on a different level then. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think if people started seeing more of that first threshold as being important, and maybe one of the most valuable things that lactate testing could bring, that sort of helps simplify the process as well, because you don't have to do quite as much testing. You don't have to do as much interpretation and data management. So yeah, I think that's a really good point that you raised. That
also in the definition of the zones, I think that probably the second threshold, you also mentioned the critical power and FTP. I mean, they fall in the very similar range at the end of the story. While the first threshold, if you use a Kogan model or an FTP model or critical power, you generally put there, at 75%, you start your zone free. But if that 75 for some people is 80% and for some other is 65, and that has a big impact, because probably the vast majority of the training is done at around those intensities. So having it 2 more hours per week at the right intensity instead of a harder or too easy one can bring a lot of value. But yeah, so this is in my idea what the lactate can mostly help you. But other than that, I think it's, as we have it now, it's a complicated metric. As you said, subjective, takes a lot of time and effort from both the coach and the athlete to have it right. And the VO2 instead? VO2? Do you like the VO2 testing, or do you see that?
I think that's I think just testing for VO2 max is quite a limited sort of thing. It doesn't really have a great deal of transferability into the day-to-day training. You get a number and it might be a lot, like I said, a lot higher than you might think, or it might be a lot lower. If it's sort of lower, that gives you again, maybe some sort of low-hanging fruit to sort of work on, depending on what you're trying to train for. Quite often, it's usually the case that someone comes in and the VO2 max, the value that the VO2 max result that they get is sort of, that's kind of what we expected, and it doesn't really tell you a great deal. I think if you are testing VO2, then the ventilatory data can be really, really interesting. So when we were testing before, we'd have people do like a spirometry test to measure kind of lung function, and then you could compare that to some of the respiratory data that you got from like a mask or an analyzer in terms of tidal volume and respiratory rate and this kind of thing. But again, that's just opening a whole new can of worms in terms of lots and lots more data to look at. And once again, that same tenet sort of stays true, where you sort of almost want to be testing quite a lot to have anything particularly useful to work for. I understand that some people just are curious and want to go in and do a very quick test to see what this VO2 max value is. But in terms of real sort of transferability and sort of insight into how you should actually train to improve, I think it's pretty limited.
On both these metrics, so let's say lactate and VO2, do you think there is a limit in FTP, let's say in watts or watts per kilo, after which those metrics becomes useful and below which they are, let's say, negligible? Or do you think they have a use across the whole range of levels, of fitness levels, let's say this way, and performance? I was first saying my opinion. In my opinion is that
Please.
below 5 watts per kilogram, more or less, give it or take 0.5 watts per kilogram, you have those metrics under your control, right? Even regularly, that's bring very little value because it's not the main problem. And after that, they can potentially be useful. So from my perspective, there is a certain type of performance that can and should be reached before going deeper into the metrics. Of course, it can vary a lot between male and female, between age. For a younger person, the number is probably higher. For an older person, can be lower because there are, so some limits of the age or the size. But more or less, this is more my general idea. So yours?
Yeah, I sort of agree and disagree. Because I think with VO2 testing, there are I think some people don't really realize there's a bit like with a power meter. There's like the sort of error range or sort of accuracy range. Usually, it's sort of with power meters now. It's sort of less than 2% or maybe 2.5% or something, which is pretty close. With a VO2 analyzer, as far as I understand, there is a bigger margin of error there that you have to account for. So if you're a highly developed athlete whose potential is quite, you're sort of fairly close to maximizing your potential, and particularly your VO2 max might not be able to change a great deal. If you're using sort of a VO2 max test to sort of as a benchmark to see how you're improving, your sort of expected rate of improvement might well fall within that accuracy range. So you actually don't know whether that's a sort of true reading or whether, if it seems like you've improved 2 or 3%, but the accuracy range is 5. Is it statistically accurate basically? So that's difficult. And I suppose that there is an argument that those that are at a lower performance level have more scope to improve, therefore sort of, I suppose, understand using some of these things to understand where they might improve the most could be important. But as you say, if they could just work on it. If these cyclists could work on almost anything and improve, there is a question of do you need these sort of more granular do you need any of this sort of more granular data to actually know what to do? I don't think you do, but if you have the resources and you have the inclination and if
it makes you happy, go for it.
If it makes you happy, yeah, and you can afford to do that, you have the time and the resources to do that. I think more information, if you can manage it and interpret it well, is good. But I think you're right in terms of those that have plenty of stuff to work on. So like we were talking about with the first threshold, if the best thing for an athlete really is to spend 3 months mostly riding around at a very easy intensity, then you don't need a great deal of other things you don't need a great deal of other data or metrics to tell you what to do. It's fairly clear. Whereas when you get to a higher level of performance, figuring out those little areas where you can actually make improvements is quite difficult, and some more detailed testing could potentially help you uncover that.
On your Garmin, last question: what screens do you have on your Garmin when you go for a training ride? What do you like to see? Because we probably have a lot of sensor. I mean, coaches usually have whatever sensor they like, so they can have the moxie, the heart rate, the core temperature, anything. What do you like to see when you do a training ride and when you do your intervals?
Yeah, so I typically have power, sort of instant or 3-second smooth power as the top line. That's kind of what I'm looking at most, I would say. Then there's like duration, so ride duration or maybe lap duration if you're doing some sort of effort. Then definitely heart rate's on there, and then some of the probably like max heart rate achieved, or like max or normalized power is another one. But I would say when I've done hill climb races, I've tried to pare that down to just power. I'm trying to think what it was. It's probably like power, time, and heart rate, basically. So I try not to have too much. Obviously, that I have plenty of screens that I can flick to if I wanted to look at SMO2, or if I was wearing a Moxie, or just have like a heart rate screen, see all the data points that are related to that. But yeah, usually power, I would say for most sessions, I think usually I'd be looking at sort of current power output, and then ride or interval time, and then sort of current heart rate as well. So pretty simple, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, simplicity is an added value most of the time, and not, how do you say, less is more.
It is, yeah, because you're trying to, I think you're always trying to glance, you're glancing down, you want to try and get as much information at a very quick and easy glance as you can. So keeping things, from in my opinion, just keeping things simple and just having the main things there is the easiest way to do that. And then you can actually, I find that sort of pacing efforts or pacing rides is just a lot easier when you have when it is simplified. Yeah. And
then an eventual debriefing, you do it at home with all the time you need.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes, Tom. Thanks a lot. I think this was very, very nice. So I discovered a lot of things on very short races, which for me are great. But is it more popular than the time trials, or is comparable? Is the same people doing time trials on uphill, or two different words?
I would say still your sort of traditional time trials, like 10-mile time trials, 25-mile time trials, are still much more popular, but I just don't think they just don't have the same kind of cult following, I don't think, of sort of cycling fans, because then the like I was saying, the hill climb discipline, especially in the UK, is quite weird and quite eccentric. The bikes are kind of weird. It's sort of, people think like, why would you, as you said at the start, why would you drive hours for a race that lasts for 2 minutes long? It's like, there's this weird contrast between people losing as much weight as they can to improve their watts per kilogram, but then the race headquarters is just full of like cakes and stuff that people have baked. So it's just a really sort of weird and sort of fun scene that I think that has a lot of charm. And I think a lot of people sort of tune into that as fans, but also as athletes, that you don't really get with something that's a bit more standard like time trials or road racing. So I think that's really the appeal of hill climbs, and hopefully they just keep they keep gaining in popularity, and other countries maybe start to put on some similar races themselves, because they're very easy events to organize in sort of relative terms. That you just need one sort of stretch of hill. It doesn't have to last all day. It's just essentially like a stopwatch at the bottom and the top.
It's
fun, and it's that's the thing. Everyone's like trying to do as well as they can, but there's a very, very friendly atmosphere, because I think everyone does bond over the fact that they're doing something that's a bit strange and that regular people think is a bit strange. So yeah, it'd be nice to see it sort of that kind of discipline and that way of running events, spread to different countries, and for it to continue gaining in popularity, because it's a lot of fun.
If I manage to lose 5 to 10 kilograms by autumn, I will come to visit my brother in London and try to join one of the
That'd be
plans. Great. And probably meet you there at this point.
Yeah. I mean, if you were in the country and there's a hill climb, I'd be happy driving a few hours to do that with you. That'd be great.
Good. Thanks again for the conversation. Bye.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks. Take care.